As we look at George Whitefield, 1714 to 1770, all you can do is just read. I'm going to start by reading this verse. This is John the Baptist's opinion of Jesus in John 1:27. It is he who comes after me, the thong of whose sandal I am not worthy to tie. These things took place in Bethany beyond the Jordan where John was baptizing. So as we approach George Whitefield, as a minister myself, and having preached for several years, I'm ashamed to even talk about him, to be honest with you, because this guy was a giant, and there's several like that in church history that we can find great inspiration from, and that's why we do this, to just bring these guys back up. And he is very neglected for this reason, because he was a contemporary of John and Charles Wesley, all right? But truth be told, he actually got them going. In fact, he was converted before they were, and he technically started Methodism before they did. But it just seems that history has shifted itself to John and Charles, and this guy has been neglected. But nonetheless, he was just the type of guy, he didn't care. He wanted to preach the cross, and that was it. So just by way of reference before we start, I highly recommend Arnold Dallamore's biographies. He has a 2-volume one, and then he has a short one, so if you like the shorter one, good quality reading, and obviously the bibliography is there. But as we look at George Whitefield, I want to introduce him just by a brief paragraph from Arnold Dallamore's lengthy biography, page 5, and I quote, "George Whitefield as the 18th century knew him, and George Whitefield as he is thought of today are two widely different persons. For the reason I had mentioned, that the Wesleys kind of overshadow him, but he will rise. Don't worry about that." Whitefield lived from 1714 to 1770, and throughout much of his adult life was as famous as any man in English-speaking world. From the age of 22 till his death, he was the foremost figure of the immense religious movement that held the attentions of multitudes on both sides of the Atlantic. Although his evangelistic labors provoked bitter opposition, they also won profound praise, and several of the great among his contemporaries in both Britain and America counted him their familiar friend. It could be said he made from the experience of all nations and ages, of the 20 men that have produced the greatest effects by the means of their single personal influence, it is highly probable the name of Whitefield must there hold a place. End of quote. So, again, he was grossly neglected by history. Thanks to Dallamore, he has his right place. But as we investigate him, here's why he's, let's just say, should be honored. He's already honored in heaven before the throne. But I quote again from the smaller volume of Arnold Dallamore, page 198, and this is what the Reverend Henry Van left a statement as to the immensity of Whitefield's labors. Now listen to this. This guy was an open-air preacher, all right? He started out in the Church of England. They said, we don't want you. Yeah, we'll get to that. But just think about what this guy did. Now, one cannot but stand amazed that his mortal frame could for the space of 30 years sustain the weight of them who would think it possible that a person should speak in the compass of a single week, and that for years, in general 40 hours, and in very many weeks 60 hours, and to thousands, and after this labor, instead of taking any rest, should be offering up prayers and intercession with hymns, spiritual songs, as his manner was in every house to which he was invited. Sir James Stephen said, "If the time spent in traveling from place to place, and some brief intervals of repose and preparation be tracted, his whole life may be said to have been consumed in the delivery of one continuous or scarcely interrupted sermon." just remember, this is in the open air. Now, I did preach in churches in the beginning, but the Church of England would not have him. He was a minister in the Church of England, but this is in the open air, all right? Think about this. To continue his description, again, page 199, Dollimore, I quote, "We notice also the breadth of his appeal." So when we say the breadth of his appeal, this is the type of people that he dealt with. He had the hearing of the coal miners of Kingswood and the slaves in America, and they understood his message. John Foster states that his preaching had the effect of giving his ideas a distinct and matchlessly vivid enunciation, insomuch that ignorant and half-barbarous men seemed in a way that amazed even themselves to understand Christian truths at their first delivery. Did you catch that? People like me, half-barbarous, and they were amazed in themselves to understand the truth of his first delivery. Mind you, as we will find out, he was a very strong doctrinal preaching. He was a very strong Calvinist, and that was his position, and that's what he preached. So that should kind of rattle our cages a little bit today when we say, hey, let's not be so strong from the pulpit. Not so with Whitefield. To hear Brother Whitefield preach to little children, many hundreds of them in their own infant language as well. End of quote. So, as you begin to just walk with me about this guy, George Whitefield. Remember his days, beginning of the 18th century, 1714 to 1770. Why do we want to look at him? And why do we look at him or her in any examination of church history? Well, there's several reasons, but as we approach this, number one, as I just said, he was a doctrinal preacher. He preached strong theology. Number two, he was very ironic. And ironic simply means that, you know what, I can get along with you. Let's just work together. Hey, you know what? An ironic guy like Whitefield says, I don't care who gets the glory. Let God be praised, let Christ be praised, and just George Whitefield, we're not worried. That's the way he thought. So he was extremely ironic in these controversies with Charles and John Wesley. Particularly John was not the easiest guy to get along with. So as we'll get to that, but he just submitted in humility during these controversies and got on with it. Zeal, well, I've just read that, 40 to 60 hours a week. I did open air work way back in the day when I was young and strong, and one message in open air with open air campaigners, that's who I worked with, a 30-minute message was enough. I'd have to rest. But just as I mentioned, this guy would preach 40 to 60 hours a week and do personal work as well. Humility, again, another one of his sterling traits that everybody that pretty much knew him described him that way, and we'll even pull up Ben Franklin from history to give us a little bit of insight into Whitefield, because he came to the United States 7 times from England. His conversion experience was quite traumatic, which is not unusual for great men and women of God. You saw that in Luther, you saw that in Bunyan. So their conversion trauma is not just a flipping, let's flick the switch and this happens. They really wrestled. And like I said, that's not unusual. Burned out? Yes, he burned out. He died at the age of 55 in Massachusetts, and he was fried. We kind of frown upon that today in the evangelical community. And I'm not sure that's a good thing. Because with our therapy and counseling and all that stuff's good, and balance and all that stuff, Whitefield knew what was at stake. So he just burned out. Just remember, this guy's preaching in the open air, and I'll show you, I'll document that by Franklin in a minute, that supposedly it could be heard by 30,000 people. Sometimes the numbers are inflated a little bit, but this is now the early part of the 1800s, that this guy could be heard by thousands of people when he preached. So I'm not sure that it's bad to burn out. And that's Spurgeon did the same thing. He just fried himself. But these guys understood what was at stake, and that's why they just gave it everything they got. And again, I'm almost ashamed to talk about this guy because I've had an easy ministerial life for the most part. Another quality of this guy as an evangelist, not a lover of money. And if you read the biographies, you'll see so many times that he was offered large sums of money, all sorts of things for his comfort. But this is just one anecdote, and I'm quoting again from Dallimore, page 146, the small volume. And when he was like I said, he went to the United States 7 times. Had quite let's just say, effective ministry there as well. But in Philadelphia, the people declared their desire to pay him an annual salary of £800 if he would preach to them merely 6 months of the year. But this offer, like that in Boston, he graciously refused. So that's why we're going to look at him. Now, if you have your outline, then we're at a man for the times. And this is where it fits in with today, because everybody is saying, what should we do? And I find it quite interesting that 17th century England was not unlike our country in a lot of ways. Politically, the structure was different, but the let's just say the iron fist, the grasp of licentiousness that has taken over is very similar. So, quick background here, and again, it's documented there. This comes from Dallimore. Again, 1660 was the Restoration, right? Charles II came back. Charles I was beheaded by the Puritans. Oliver Cromwell ruled for 7-8 years, and that was done, and the Puritan Revolution was over. In that sense, it sort of failed politically, and we've made allusion to this before, and they realized this, that it was a political failure, but an ecclesiastical success, the whole Puritan movement of theology. In 1662, 2,000 Puritans were ejected from their pulpits. Preachers were ejected from their pulpits. And this is where John Bunyan fits in, and we'll do him hopefully next year, that they would not let him preach. So he spent his time in Newgate Prison, writing for us Pilgrim's Progress, among many other things. So the time is characterized by incredible licentiousness, godlessness, drunkenness, immorality, crime increased. The prison conditions were horrible, because as the crime increased, the consequent outcome of that was the authorities would obviously cast people in prison, and it was just despicable, the conditions that they lived in. Why was this? Well, they said, we don't want the Puritan ethic. That's it. We're done with it. We don't want the stringentness, as they would have said, of what the Puritan rule had brought, and we're casting that off along with a restored monarchy. Does it sound pretty similar to the age that we live in right now? We don't want the restrictive Judeo-Christian ethic. We're throwing it out, and licentious rules. So the monarchy's restored. Charles II is back. But it's the Church of England now that I want to talk about, and this is the church that Whitefield was ordained in, and he was faithful to it, although they weren't faithful to him. Imagine that, and we'll see this in a couple minutes here, that probably one of the greatest evangelists since Paul, the organized Church of England, says you can't preach in our churches. A few here and there would let him preach, but now as history has vindicated itself, I guess we all do stupid things, but nonetheless. So here's the characteristic of the Church of England: deism, Arianism, skepticism, empty formality, and pretty much what it sounds like, an unregenerate clergy. Okay, so this is the context that Whitefield will get into in the early 1730s. And it's critical to see that the church was pretty much dead. Just a formality that they participated in, a cultural formality. And the skepticism, in actuality, was almost to the point where if you were a real believer, you were considered an enthusiast, and that you kind of pushed back from that. Those who were still real believers were somewhat moderate in that respect. Not George Whitefield. When he after he got converted, when he came out guns blazing with the gospel in a good way. But here's something that was very critical. 1689 in England, the prohibition of the importation of liquor. So that started what they called in that time the gin craze, where the common people were making gin on their own. And it literally destroyed the fabric of the society. And even those in authority who were cynics and atheists were concerned about, this is destroying the country. Sound familiar today? What's going on in the United States with the amount of drug abuse, the amount of illegal drugs coming over the border, the amount of overdoses, just the whole, let's just say, destruction of the society because of these illicit drugs? Yeah, very, very similar. So that's the world of George Whitefield, what he came into, all right? And I think that's very helpful for us as we ask ourselves the question, what do we do as a church? Is the answer political? To some degree it is, because we participated, but not ultimately. And as we look at Whitefield, we'll realize that when we say the answer is the gospel, that's not a trite statement. Because this guy, by the power of the Spirit of God, literally changed England and the United States for well. So here's a brief survey. And again, if you want to read this yourself, I have the notation there. It's on banneroftruth.org. I just derived the information from that. But you can just Google that in. It's quite good. Probably take you 15 minutes to read it. But born 1714, Gloucester, England. Mother kept an inn. So right from the start, it's obvious he was not, let's just say, born with a blue spoon in his mouth. His early life was not religious, and it pretty much characterized the age that he lived in. He went to grammar school. But here's where, and this is the value again of church history, here is where God takes a natural ability, and when he saves you, he uses it, okay? I had no intention of ever being a preacher or a minister myself. I dropped out of speech class in college and quit college because I said, I'm not giving a speech. I don't want to get anything involved with public communication. So what happens, I get redeemed, and there's a gift that I have, nothing like Whitefield's, that's for sure. But there it is. So, but here, pay notation to this. In his grammar school age, he was noticed for his power of elocution and his memory. So he wrote plays himself. He did some public dissertations. So there it was right from the start, was this guy that his elocution, and that's just a fancy word to say, in the way he communicated, the way he preached, it was unparalleled. So at the age of 15, he left school, still serving in the inn. At 18, he entered Oxford as a servitor. Okay, he didn't have the money to pay for Oxford, so what a servitor did was he was like a private servant to young men who we would call gentlemen who came to Oxford, and he would be their butler to some degree, if you want to say it that way. So he didn't really go into Oxford with strong religious sentiments, but that started to change. Because when he was at Oxford, there was a group of men, and the Wesleys were actually in this, and they eventually called themselves the Holy Club, and that's where the name Methodist came from. But these men were concerned for their souls, and Wesley, it was in it. And just remember where he came from. He came from a strong Church of England family. His father was a minister, but he was not a believer at this point. And that's another biography worth reading, Wesley. But this group of these guys that met there in Oxford was very legalistic, very aesthetic, pursuing personal holiness, which isn't a bad idea. fasting, praying, but they didn't they didn't have the gospel. And just by way of side note, when Wesley went to America to be a missionary to Georgia, he went and came back a complete failure because he wasn't even a believer. It was his influence by the Moravians that eventually led him to Christ. But here's again, and I want to emphasize, this is a little bit of Whitefield's conversion experience. All right, very, very strong, very traumatic. So, and this is another thing that we want to encourage people in as we lead them to Christ, point them to Christ. That it's not always just a simple. It is a confession of faith. Whosoever shall call upon the name of the Lord shall be saved. But there's many times birthing trauma in that. Before that the wrestling with truth, wrestling with the things of God. So we don't want to downplay that. We want to let God have His way in that. But as we look at particularly Whitefield's conversion here, and I quote from page 16 in Dallamore's short work, while under this influence, meaning this holy club, Whitefield read a book which suddenly altered his entire outlook. It was written by a Scotsman, Henry Scougal, and it was entitled The Life of God in the Soul of Man. I have the book as well, worth reading, just a little guy. So there's a seed sown by this Scotsman, Henry Scougal, probably had no idea what it would yield, but quote, Whitefield knew nothing as yet of the miracle of the new birth. He assumed that performing good works he would place himself on the pathway to heaven. So he didn't know what to do with this book, but it lit a fire in his conscience that he realized that he must be born again. So he struggled with this for quite a while. He was in this tension of seeking the grace of God. And again, I quote page 17, when the bearing of these difficulties brought no experience of the life of God, Whitefield undertook still greater self-denial. He left off eating such things as fruits and sweets and wore a patched gown and dirty shoes. He adopted the customs of a German cult, the quietist, talking very little and wondering if he should talk at all, etc. End of quote. But the interesting thing is he still was pursuing this very ascetic lifestyle, knowing that he needed to be born again. But he wasn't there yet. And I again quote from Dallamore, page 18, still finding only failure in all these efforts, he decided the only thing he could do is give up his association with his holy club. So for the matter of, let's say 18 months or so, he struggled with this. But this is his conversion experience. So here's a guy who's struggling with conversion, struggling with what it means to be born again, pursuing all these ascetic practices which they had been doing in the Holy Club, doing ministry in the flesh. But again, Dallamore says this, quote, but by now, when there was nothing else that Whitefield could do, God revealed himself in grace and granted Whitefield that which he had learned could never be earned. In utter desperation and rejection of all self-trust, he cast himself on the mercy of God through Jesus Christ, and a ray of hope granted him from above assured him he would not be cast out. End of quote. So that was his conversion experience. And again, we learn from that because sometimes in the American church we cheapen the conversion experience. And I'm all for preaching gospel. I'm even all for giving altar calls. That doesn't sit too well with some people, but I'm a big fan of that. Having preached in the open air, calling people to Christ, I think it's a good thing. But let's say again, though, the regeneration is instant. We know that. But the process of conversion coming to that is the birth pangs, isn't it? And Whitefield, as I mentioned earlier, among many others. The next step in his life is he then began embarking on very stringent biblical studies, reading the Puritans, etc. But it was obvious that something had happened because he had immediate influence on people around him. So this is where they began these little societies, okay? And just meeting with people, praying, reading scripture, studying. And this is what the Methodist movement actually came out of. We don't have time to get into that. But he pursued that for a while, and then he was also in the process of pursuing ordination in the Church of England. He was always very faithful to the Church of England to the end. But his first sermon, June 27th, 1736, lit a fire. Now, this was a sermon in a church, okay? So this is when he was allowed to preach in the church. And here's a description of it, and I quote page 24, Dallimore. Last Sunday I preached my first sermon in the Church of St. Mary de Cripp, where I was baptized. Curiosity drew a large congregation. The sight at first a little awed me, but I was comforted with a heartfelt sense of divine presence, and soon found the unspeakable advantage of having been accustomed to speaking when a boy at school and exhorting and teaching the prisoners and poor people while at university. By these means I was kept from being daunted overmuch. So there was that, let's just say, human ability of communicating and elocution that the Spirit, there was a switch here, okay? As I proceeded, I perceived the fire kindled till at last, though so young and amidst a crowd of those who knew me in my infant childish days, I trust I was able to speak with some degree of gospel authority. So you notice, end of quote. You notice what he said, a fire kindled. So there it was that the switch was thrown. And this is where God took a man who was just a humble guy and somewhat educated, and after he converted him, after he saved him, he flicked the switch. And the Spirit of God. So why is it, at this point I'll answer this question, and I'm again reading from Dallimore, page 115. He says this, quote, "What was there in his preaching or his person which attracted such throngs?" And this would come after this time, because he was preaching some churches, and then as he went into the open air, the floodgates just came in. And hey, he didn't have $100,000, worship team and all that sort of thing, all that jazz, right? He didn't have all the bells and whistles of the modern church. He preached, like I said, initially in some of their churches, but they refused to let him go after they found out he was evangelical. So, and then he went into the open air, and we're going to talk about that. That will put a tear in your eye. Just wait, hold on with me when you see this transition into the open air. But here's the question, and I quote, what was from Dallimore, page 115, what was there in his preaching or his person which attracted such throng? Doubtless the masses of these people were drawn by a deep spiritual hunger. Okay? That's what we had talked about in the introduction. So do we have that today in our country? Maybe not yet, but as the whole thing goes the direction that it is, I pray that will happen. Amidst the conditions surrounded them, the widespread rejection of moral restraint, blatant denial of the Scriptures, rampant crime, and glaring heartlessness, they had long sought in, listen to this now, they had long sought in vain for help from the churches. The generality of parochial clergy were looked upon in bitter contempt. End of quote. So here it is. He's entering a scene where people, they're thirsty now. And the formal church, the Church of England, is not doing its duty in preaching the gospel. Yeah, there was some that were, Isaac Watts was a contemporary, and there was others, but the church itself was not doing what it was supposed to do. So what happens in Whitefield's life? He preached and began to minister, and the crowd started to come. Churches started to invite him initially. Then he decides to take a trip to Georgia. Right, as I mentioned, he went to the United States 7 times. He went there to preach, and that's another subject in itself. He was received very well in the United States. He returns back to England, all right, and is refused opportunities in the Church of England. Okay, they didn't want him preaching in the churches. Now, a few here and there would, For example, April 1739, when he came back, the Islington Church refused permission to allow him to preach. Okay, so here's a guy that's already has momentum in communicating the gospel and drawing large crowds in the churches that he would have been preaching in. And in the United States, had a very successful ministry. But he makes a move that's one of those moves that's historical. And I say that because this is his move into the open air. Now there were other open air preachers at this time up in Wales, in that area. They were ministering. Some of these other names, Howell Harris and Seneca and others, we won't get into them. But if you read the book, you'll realize that others were starting to do this. But here's the account that Dallimore gives. I just love this. And I quote page 255. This is the decision to go to Kingswood. All right. Now Kingswood is not Beverly Hills. All right. Kingswood is the area where the miners lived, and this is the description that Dallimore gives. Humanly speaking, I quote, "Humanly speaking, there could hardly have been a more unlikely congregation than the Kingswood Colliers." Colliers, a miner. The district contained some thousands of them, and the conditions under which they existed were deplorable. Men, women, and children laboring in dark tunneling in the earth, working long hours, and their lives were never free from dirt and dust that attended their employment. So notorious was their settlement for viciousness that a stranger seldom ventured in, and the Colliers in turn lived unto themselves a sad and sullen race who looked out upon the outside world in hatred and fear. Moreover, there had been occasions on which, seized by wild mob spirit, the Colliers had stormed Bristol, pillaging, terrorizing, till the crazed mood spent itself, and they returned to their seclusion and grime. But here's Whitefield's attitude, end of quote. But I quote this again, same author, Dallimore. "My bowels have long since yearned," he wrote at the time, "toward the poor colliers, who are very numerous, as a shepherd has no, as sheep with no shepherd." End of quote. So here, amidst these other things that Whitefield was doing at this point, when he returned from Georgia, teaching in prisons, conducting the societies, church wouldn't let him continue to preach, but he had this burden. Okay. That's quite common in the Christian experience. That where do you think the burden came from? It came from God. So as he preaches to these people, there's unparalleled success. That there is a great response from these colliers, and there is credible conversions that were bona fide and lasting conversions. But this is a description of his experience here in preaching to these colliers as a start. And I quote Dallimore again, and this is what Whitefield said, page 263. "Having no righteousness of their own to renounce, they were glad to hear of Jesus, who was a friend of publicans, and came not to call the righteous, but sinners to repentance." And this statement is worth the whole lecture right here. "The first discovery of their being affected was to see the white gutters made by the tears which plentifully fell down their black cheeks as they came out of their coal pits. Hundreds and hundreds of them were soon brought under deep conviction, which, as the event proved, happily ended in a sound and thorough conversion. The change was visible to all, though numbers chose to impute it to anything rather than the finger of God." End of quote. So this is it. This is his entrance into the open air, and he then did that till 1770. And if you read the biography again, or look at the short biography online, as I mentioned, the Banner of Truth, you will see what the effect that he had. And as I mentioned, there's other good men along with him that were involved in this. But from there on out, he was in the open air preaching to thousands. He preached for 31 years, and England, Scotland 14 times, Ireland 2 times, U.S. 37 times. But I want to chronicle what Ben Franklin said about him when he was in the United States. And again, he was actually friends with Franklin. And it appears that in Franklin's early life, he was interested in, to some degree, interested in spiritual things. He's always just cast off as an agnostic, which he probably died that way. I guess there was never any, let's just say, document of his conversion. But he was very friendly with Whitefield. And this is what he says about Whitefield. And again, I quote Dallamore's short version, page 179. Ben Franklin was one of the most discerning of men. We saw that when Whitefield first arrived in Philadelphia, Franklin took particular notice of him, reported on the effects of his ministry, estimated that he could be heard by 30,000 people, and complimented his oratorical powers. End of quote. So his audiences were rather large. Whether they were actually that large is, again, a question of history. But he was quite effectual in being able to proclaim the gospel. And as I mentioned, his gospel was the gospel in the sense of repentance and faith. And it was very rooted, as I mentioned earlier, in his Calvinistic tradition. Now, the next thing I want to look at is these controversies that he was involved in, all right? And this is another thing that we learned from church history, that when there are movements, revival movements, there's controversy, there's difficulty. Because there's a God in heaven and a devil in hell. And this was not unusual. And this, as great as Whitefield was, for his humility, his zeal, just the incredible power to preach in the open air, the thousands of people that he reached, his humility is, I don't know if you could say his best quality. But he actually encouraged the Wesleys to get into the open air. Because Charles, in the meantime, after George was saved, eventually Charles got saved, and John and Charles got saved. And you might know a little bit about John's conversion. He was mixing with the Moravians, and then he was listening to, I think it was a commentary on Galatians, right, being read in one of the societies, and he said, "My heart felt strangely warmed." And that was his conversion. So he started in the Church of England, but Whitefield and he were friends. And Whitefield said, go into the open air. And he encouraged him in that. And he did, and began to experience a lot of success. And he worked with Whitefield. And these small societies they had, that's why they were called Methodists. Okay? But the problem is, and this happened very early in Whitefield's ministry, that Wesley was very strongly against any kind of predestination, and he believed in the Christian perfection as well. So I'll give you a little bit of background on this, and I quote page 62, Dallimore. Accordingly convinced by the supernatural, this meaning Wesley, experiences that he had no longer needed to remain secondary to Whitefield. He prepared a sermon against predestination, but wanting further evidence that his doctrine was true, he cast a lot to obtain it. The lot indicated preach and print, and therefore he preached the sermon. It had been exactly 4 weeks from the day Whitefield had introduced him to his Bristol congregation and conjured him not to do the very thing he was doing. So Whitefield was rooted in his Calvinistic tradition. Whitefield, not Wesley, and Whitefield pretty much begged him not to do it because he knew what the consequent result would be. And he was very ironic in his response, Whitefield was, but Wesley was bold in decrying Whitefield, and the consequent result, there was a split. So Whitefield went his way into the open air and kept preaching. Wesley went his way and pursued his course. And we have a tendency to think, well, Wesley's the founder of the Methodists. Well, not really. That's what the groups were called at that point. But he took his doctrine and went his way, and Whitefield split. And in many cases, some of the properties that Whitefield had raised money for, along with the Wesleys, he just take it. That's the kind of guy he was. He was so focused on the gospel. But this is just a little bit about Whitefield's doctrines. Again, I quote page 70 of Dallimore. To Whitefield, doctrines of grace were not separate tenets to be accepted or rejected one by one. Rather, they were so joined together as to compose a unified system of theology. In this regard, he stated, I bless God, His Spirit has convinced me of our eternal election by the Father through the Son, and our free justification through faith in His blood, of our sanctification as a consequence of that, and our final perseverance and glorification as a result of this. These I am persuaded God has joined together. These neither men nor devils shall ever be able to put asunder. Finally, and catch this statement, I'm still quoting Dallimore, page 1. Finally, Whitefield looked upon these doctrines as the foundation of a most fervent, soul-winning ministry. Did you get that? What's the, and whether you fall into the Calvinistic camp or not, that's up to you. But what's unequivocal about this, and this is where a little knowledge is not good sometimes, because I have a little knowledge about some things to get myself in trouble. But you will hear people say the doctrines of grace don't lean themselves to evangelism. Okay, have you ever heard that? Yeah, you've heard that, right? But here's a guy that probably was, as I mentioned earlier, one of, if not the greatest evangelist since Paul. In his forthright power and authority. Remember, he didn't have the bells and whistles. Wherever he could preach in the open air, he would preach. He said, even if the Pope gave me a pulpit, I'd preach the gospel. That's how focused he was. But this is a very essential lesson that we have to learn, is that good theology is the foundation of not just good preaching, exposition, the whole counsel of God, but of evangelism. Why is that? Because I tell you, in my limited experience in the open air, just riding into New York City in a van on hot summer nights, and you could feel, we were preaching out on Times Square, we preached on other areas, but you could feel the oppression. And at that time, I was very young, only a believer, about 4 years, and my theology was developing. But boy, if you're not filled with the conviction that God's got a people and He's going to save them, it's easy to get just cast aside. Because what am I doing this for? Am I offering this message to just kind of flipping it up in the air and hoping somebody will grab it? Or am I offering it where there's a conviction here that God will save His people, and this is what I'm going to do? And that was the foundation of now, just by way of wrapping it up with the Wesleys, Charles eventually came to pretty much Calvinistic tradition. John didn't, but they reconciled. Okay, to John's credit. Again, personalities in church history, we have them. Personalities in the church. But a little bit about his life then, as far as personal life. He did marry in 1741. But again, it was not an estranged marriage. But the marriage that he partook of, his wife obviously knew what he was doing, and it would have been something that I suppose that she says, well, if I got to live with this man, I got to realize what he's going to do, because his heart is evangelism, and that's what he lived and died for, evangelism. Well, just a little bit about his death. He actually died in the United States, and he was staying, and I'm quoting from page 195 in Dallimore, following this tremendous effort, meaning preaching effort, that he had just done because he was sick. He probably had asthma and everything else. Imagine that, preaching all those years. No microphones now. They had something called a sounding board. I'm not sure what it is, but it seemed like the sketches that you see, there's something here, but certainly didn't have it at all times. Following this tremendous effort, I quote, Whitefield went on home, the home of Reverend Jonathan Parsons of the Old South Presbyterian Church in Newburyport. He's in the United States. While the family was at supper, he was tired and he would go to bed. He was on the landing stairs when the door was opened to admit a host who gathered outside, and earnestly requested him to preach. And the guy's gone to his deathbed, and these people come to want him to preach again after he's just been preaching. Remember, the statistic I gave you, 40 to 60 hours a week. How many he did in this day, I don't know. He paused, candle in hand, preached Christ till the candle burned out of its socket and died away. The candle was symbolic of his life, which was also burned out and speedily dying away. Richard Smith, a young man who traveled with him, reported that Whitefield awoke about 2 in the morning and seemed to pant for breath. A good pulpit sweat to say, he said, may give me relief. I shall be better after preaching. Smith told him he wished he would not preach so often, but Whitefield answered, I would rather wear out than rust out. As I mentioned at the beginning, that's a challenge to us in ministry with our American way. Leave a dog, sleeping dog lie there. He woke at 4, got out of bed and opened the window, saying, I'm almost suffocated. I scarce can breathe. Mr. Parsons came in, and Smith went to bring the doctor. On my coming back, he stated, I saw death on his face. His eyes were fixed, his upper lip drawing inward every time he breathed. 7, Sunday, September 30th, George Whitefield ceased all struggle on earth, and his soul took its flight to the presence of God. End of quote. So I just encourage you to get, this is Dollamore's, this is a short one, it's excellent, but this is just as good, the two volumes, very readable. So the question is, what did we learn from George Whitefield? I mentioned some things in the beginning that were challenges, and I think were helpful. But, and again, here he is. Again, he suffered a lot of persecution from the church, obviously. Church of England, mobs threw stuff at him. He was injured, death threats, all sorts of things. But here's the guy's attitude amidst all this controversy with the Wesleys, and even when he returned from the United States, the first time a lot of work he started had somewhat gone into the Wesleys' power. And this is what some said to him, and I quote page 154, Dollamore. Several of them asserted that thereby he would lose his fame, and that would cause him finally to be forgotten by future generations. Here's a guy that was quite popular, and as Wesley's movement arose, he was, I suppose, according to these people, in danger of being pushed aside, which certainly wasn't going to happen. And here's what Whitefield says, quote, let the name of Whitefield perish, but Christ be glorified, end of quote. The whole lecture is worth that. Let the name of Christ be glorified. Let the name of Whitefield perish. So here's a guy that knew he was a fragile instrument, and that he was in the hands of God, and he had his focus right. And I think of Paul's words in Galatians, right? God forbid that I should glory save in the cross of Jesus Christ. So, again, I encourage you to read these biographies. You can get online with Banner of Truth. They had a short documentary in there. That's in your bibliographical section.